And welcome back. George Norrie with Sidney Kirkpatrick, award-winning documentary filmmaker and best-selling author. Sidney Kirkpatrick is a graduate of Kent School in Kent, Connecticut, Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, and NYU Film School. His latest book, Edgar Cayce, An American Prophet, is the definitive biography of Edgar Cayce, who's best known as the Sleeping Prophet. And Sidney, first of all, thank you for keeping the memory of Edgar Cayce alive.
Now, it's all students of the Cayce readings, all researchers have you to thank for informing, keeping your listeners so informed about this Edgar Cayce.
It's exciting. I mean, he was one of a kind, wasn't he?
One of a kind, and you on your show in years past, you've had both of his sons, Edgar Evans Cayce and Hugh Lynn Cayce, and his grandson you've interviewed. I mean, that's really remarkable, and it's helped so much to carry the greater message forward.
How did he get his incredible abilities, Sidney?
Well, you could trace it right back to a childhood incident when he was playing baseball, in elementary school. He got hit in the back with a baseball. And it seemed to knock him unconscious. But the strange thing about it was he could carry on a conversation. He foretold who would win the next presidency. He revealed things about his teacher, his elementary school teacher, that a student his age would have no right to know. But, that was not explored. He seemed to get better the next morning. He actually diagnosed himself, told a physician how he should be treated. And it wasn't for many years in his 20s when he was hypnotized that this strange third other, came back. So he was hypnotized and again, could carry on conversations. And yet at the same time, he couldn't be, he was impervious to sort of being shaken out of it. At one point, physicians testing him would stick needles in his skin. In one egregious case, they pulled one of his fingernails out, and he didn't as much as flinch.
Ouch.
He was like he was in a deep, deep coma. And yet, he could answer questions.
Yeah, explain to us, Sidney, the method he used to come up with these incredible things that he talked about: Atlantis, the pyramids, health issues, all kinds of things. What was his methodology?
Well, it evolved over the years. At first, it was getting hit by a baseball, knocked out, and then he was hypnotized. What made all of this so remarkable was that he internalized the process, and it evolved. He learned to put himself into this deep trance state. And once he was in this trance state, it really was incredible. Hard to believe. He wasn't your 1-800 psychic phone line. He didn't speak in vague, ambiguous terms, but specifics, names, dates, locations. And in terms of the medical readings, which is perhaps even the most remarkable, he talked about specific body parts, blood type, and temperature. He would be given the name of George Norrie, and he would essentially go organ by organ through your body,
wow,
diagnosing illness. And again, it's the specifics that made such a big difference: blood type, body temperature.
Well, they called him the Sleeping Prophet. Was he alert? Did he know what he was saying?
No, and he had to be told afterwards what happened. And it became easier once the system got more defined and they could hire a stenographer. But for the first, several hundred readings, it was a crapshoot, and it was a sort of trial and error process, say, to see what worked. Like you had to learn to ask specific questions to him. You couldn't ask these generalizations.
He died in 1945, Sidney. It was way before we had social media, way before television made it as big as it is. We had radio at the time. But how did the media handle him? Was he well known?
At various points in his career, he was well known. And the New York Times did a massive front page spread, which made him a sensation at that time. And he grew up in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, which was a relatively small area, remote, but hundreds and then thousands of people would eventually visit Hopkinsville and try to get these trance readings from him. He didn't charge for what he did. He believed it was a gift from God and that it was to be shared.
I still use his remedies for so many different things. I mean, I just, every time I want to be able to just prevent something, I read information on Edgar Cayce, like almonds to fight cancer and stuff like that, and
right.
and I do it.
Yeah, this was recently brought home to me because I had a gallbladder operation, which went south.
Oh my God! When did that happen?
Oh, just in the last year and a half.
Oh my God!
And I was actually in a hospital bed for a year and a half.
Oh my God, Sidney! I didn't know that.
But what pulled me through? Not only my devoted wife Nancy, with whom we collaborated on Edgar Cayce and American Prophet, but we used Cayce remedies. And before that time, I was, obviously more than familiar with his life story, the compelling elements of the life story, but I never had to rely on the medical readings themselves as we did this time. And boy, I swear it saved my life.
That's fantastic. How soon did things kick in when you started doing his remedy recommendations?
It's difficult to actually pinpoint times because so many of the recommendations were building up your immune system.
Yes.
So they were secondary, and sometimes it took months. I mean, now I'm over it. I'm out of the hospital, but I've got to build up my muscle because I've been on my back for so long.
My previous guest is an expert on Egyptology, and his name is Robert Schoch. And, he's been to the pyramids, he's been to the Sphinx, and he brought up you and Edgar Cayce. Cayce talked about the Hall of Records at the base of the Sphinx, and they have indeed found a enclosure down there. They haven't gone in there, but they have found some kind of structure where Edgar Cayce said it was.
Yes. Amazing. And, that's what's so spectacular and why Cayce is so important to study, because things, especially medical things he said, and what he said about reincarnation, which was dismissed as science fiction in his time, has since proven out. Obviously, you can't prove reincarnation, but there's enough scintillating details, like the studies done at UVA, to suggest that indeed, there's truth to it. So, in many respects, this is a spectacular time to study Cayce because science, medical science especially, technology is catching up to these readings. And we have so many to go on. I mean, because he was surrounded by physicians so early in his life, there were witnesses to these readings, and then eventually a full-time stenographer. So today we have, some 14,000 of these readings that are anywhere from 2 pages to 10, 20 pages. in some instances. So we have this incredible record with which to study. Nancy and I often bemoan the fact that we came in late to the Cayce work, that Cayce had already passed, and we would never get our own reading. However, as we continue to study this, we realize now is the time to start seriously. You can accomplish research in ways that were impossible to do in Cayce's lifetime.
Absolutely.
Plus, Cayce had his firewall built up, and they didn't attach names to the readings in the Cayce vault.
How accurate?
How
accurate, Sidney, do you think he was percentage-wise? Most of the time?
I would say easily in the 90 percentile.
That's remarkable.
But, things that, again, were considered science fiction now in many places are state-of-the-art medicine, like what he was saying about psoriasis, the skin condition. Cayce very early on said that it was not a skin condition, but that was a symptom of a deeper, greater problem, that the colon was leaching toxins into the system, and cure yourself or treat yourself for psoriasis, you had to go on a strict diet.
He was right.
The most recently is light therapy. Cayce recommended all manner of different light therapies because it was non-invasive and could easily be treated using different kinds of lights, infrared lights. There's something called a violet ray. But again, all kinds of new evidence suggesting that indeed Cayce was right on the money.
Sidney, how did Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe come into the Cayce story?
There's so many famous people or important people, influencers associated with Cayce, but they all come from different backgrounds. Certainly, Elvis Presley was a big student of Edgar Cayce's, and actually on the night he died, on his bedstand was a book on Edgar Cayce.
Wow. Was it your book?
No, gosh, I wish it was. There's speculation that it has been, but I couldn't say for sure.
How about Marilyn Monroe?
Yeah, well, Marilyn Monroe started using beauty aids recommended by Cayce. Cayce covers such a wide variety of subject matter. I mean, almost anything you can think of, Cayce commented on, including like the Bible, where Cayce would say, well, that's not really how it happened. How it happened was, or Jesus didn't say this, he said that. And anyway, so you have beauty aids as well as the Bible, as well as reincarnation, astrology. Gloria Swanson, the great film star, people will remember Sunset Boulevard. Gloria Swanson turned Marilyn onto the Cayce work, and if you look at photographs, even late in life, I think Gloria Swanson lived to be over 100.
Confirm this story I heard, Sidney, a long time ago, that Edgar Cayce was once getting on an elevator. The door opened, and he saw a group of people in there, and he used to be able to read auras. He could not see any auras of any of the individuals and backed out of the elevator. He got scared. The elevator door closed.
Isn't that fascinating? Yes. Hugh Lynn, who was with him that day, Edgar Cayce's son, often shared that story.
And apparently the elevator door shut and the cable snapped or something like that?
Yeah. And elevator crashed to the bottom.
And they all died.
That was not entirely unique in the Cayce work. There was during that same trip to New York where the elevator had the problem, Cayce was at a diner, and the waitress serving him put the food down, and Cayce looked up at her and said, "Don't go." And she was like, "What are you talking about? Don't go." And he said, "You're thinking of taking a drive out to Long Island, or out of the city."
Yeah.
And she was confused and like, "Who is this guy? And how would you know that that's what I intended to do?" And
why is he telling me not to go?
Right. And she didn't go, and her boyfriend, who did go, got in a terrible car accident.
Oh my God! And she would have. She could have died.
Right.
Unbelievable. Lots to talk with you about, Sidney, as we talk about the life of Edgar Cayce. And the latest book I have from you was written and published in 2019, Edgar Cayce, An American Prophet. But I remember having you on Coast to Coast like almost 20 years ago.
Yes. You on the debut of that book, we've also written True Tales from the Cayce Archive, which is a compendium of the people who had readings. And that provides all kinds of really interesting insights, because sometimes it puts the readings that were given in context. For example, the one I like to use is Lamar Jones. And this is a reading which you might just breeze through, flip right through, because it doesn't seem to, there's nothing super dramatic,
right,
or obviously insightful. But then if you realize that this is for an artist, and Cayce is talking about art and the power of art to affect people's lives and affect families' lives. But then if you dig down to find out who received that reading, you discover that Lamar Jones is a tombstone cutter in Selma, Alabama, and he's the most sought-after tombstone cutter because he tapped somehow in what's written on the tombstone, as well as the artwork, the angel. One of his most famous ones is a marble angel with wings. That's what Cayce is talking about, the power of art. And you don't have to have a paintbrush to touch people's lives in that way. And that's what Cayce is talking about in that reading. And so it comes into context.
And Cayce always didn't listen to his own advice, did he?
Well, he was obviously he was all too human. And, at times he was lazy, and, he had a fondness for cigarettes. I mean, he was chain smoking, and actually the, cigarette readings are really interesting. There's one reading, it says it's the toxins, it's the additives put into cigarettes, that are the most harmful. And I'm certainly not going to advocate, smoking, but it's just an interesting little insight. But he's, it's for a man. He struggled his entire career. I mean, and you can understand why. On a personal level, when he entered into trance, he had no idea what he was going to say, and he only had to be told afterwards what he'd said. So, he was always fearful of harming someone he loved or someone who wanted help by something he said. And he had no medical training. I mean, he essentially had a 7th, 8th grade education.
Tremendous. Sidney, we're going to take a short break. We'll come back with more in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with Sidney Kirkpatrick here as we talk about the life of Edgar Cayce. Your books, Sidney, are they still available, obviously?
Yes, absolutely. Amazon.com. True Tales from the Cayce Archive and Edgar Cayce, American Prophet. And it's Cayce, Cayce.
Exactly.
And if you go to, if somebody wants to read some examples of my work, just go on CayceUniverse.com and go to archive. And I think you'll find some interesting personal stories in there from the people who had readings.
Now, let's talk about the Association for Research and Enlightenment. When was that established?
It was established in the 30s, 31. Cayce operated a hospital, and it was really the first of its kind. And you imagine being psychically vetted before you could become a doctor at this hospital. But it specialized in holistic health treatments and the treatments put forth in the readings. As Cayce discovered, the difficulty was not getting the information for the treatments, but finding physicians, medical professionals who would follow it. And so the solution was to build your own hospital. Unfortunately, the hospital got up and operating as the Great Depression deepened, and it eventually closed its doors. But the association, the people who helped put that hospital plan together, formed the Association for Research and Enlightenment. And it's still going today. It's in Virginia Beach, and actually, it's in the building. There's several. It's a fairly large campus, and there's several buildings right from Cayce's day, including the old hospital building. Of course, it's not a hospital anymore, but they have all kinds of. They do all kinds of publishing, lectures. They sponsor speakers throughout the country.
How many fans of Edgar Cayce are out there, Sidney?
Well, at the sort of height of interest, when Jeff Stern, the author, wrote A Sleeping Prophet, there were upwards of 50, 100,000 members. And it's a nominal, cost of membership. And there are all kinds of great benefits, including a magazine called Venture Inward, which my wife and I edited for several years. But it's an outreach, and if you really want to delve deep into the Cayce work, you end up in Virginia Beach.
That's where it's at. Yeah. Was he a happy person?
Yes, I would say so. He had a great sense of humor. He loved people. That was a defining characteristic about him. He really loved these people, and it was a great source of sorrow and discouragement when World War II got started, and so many friends of his and children of friends of his pleaded with him to get readings, health readings, and to want to know what happened with their son or daughter involved in the war. And there were so many requests that he couldn't begin to fill them. And so they had a waiting list. When he died, I think the waiting list was almost two years ahead.
Now, when he died, I had always heard stories that these trance states wore him down. Is that true?
Yes. In readings he gave himself, for himself, the source, who or whatever it was coming through Cayce, said to limit the readings to 2 or 3 a day. Shortly before his death, he was doing upwards of 10, 12 readings. And it was a drain. It was like a soul drain. And everybody around him saw that, but they couldn't stop him, from giving all of these readings, because he truly did want to help people. And as I said earlier, he believed this was a gift from God. And even though he was not presumptuous into believing that he was God's messenger, he believed that this was a skill, a talent God had given him, and it had to be used. and he wasn't charged for it. And I think that's one of the most compelling things about Cayce, even when earlier in his career, when news got out in the congregation, in the church congregations he was a member of. He was a devout Christian, by the way.
Yeah.
Often a deacon, a church secretary. And I don't know where I was going.
Well, you're talking about him being a deacon in the church and everything else.
Yeah, well, he was a devout Christian and read constantly reading the Bible, read it, once a year.
Believed in God.
Year of his life.
He was a believer in God, right?
Yes.
And it showed in his work.
The readings just confirmed as such. It depends on how you want to interpret the sort of cosmic Edgar Cayce, because he talked about astrology, he talked about reincarnation. These were fundamental to all the readings, and as you dig deeper into the Cayce work, I mean, you might be attracted because you want to find out about the pyramids, how Atlantean technology was used, to build the pyramids. But that's not what eventually, as you dig deeper, you start seeing that you have to take every reading as a whole, that many medical conditions are brought on by stress, by factors, other than, physical factors.
Truly remarkable.
Right. So you begin to understand that the history readings are intimately connected with the medical readings, and that it's all one big whole.
What would you say, Sidney, might be the most profound thing Edgar Cayce ever did that was just truly remarkable?
Well, Edgar Cayce, of course, believed, and the readings put forth, the continuity of the soul. And it looked at Earth in this dimension as a university Earth, in which you were to learn lessons and learn to work with others, learn to cooperate. In that sense, you're in these readings, sort of taking about University Earth, all kinds of interesting insights about the continuity of the souls. Some come back as ghosts, or stuck on the Earth plane in ghosts. They talk about alien visitation, and the reading specifically states that yes, aliens have visited our planet. Unfortunately, he doesn't go into greater detail than that, or much greater detail, except to say that on 2 occasions they visited. But there's a proviso that states you will not recognize them, recognize the aliens, because you just don't recognize that as a form of life. So I suppose what he's saying there is you can see them and not even know they're there. Cayce often talks about, in these University Earth readings, other dimensions in which souls travel to after they pass on.
What did he say about Atlantis, Sidney?
Well, he confirms essentially what Plato has said, and the cataclysms that eventually sank a series of cataclysms, 3, and how tsunamis, earthquakes caused refugees from Atlantis to flee across the world. One place, Atlanteans, or I guess the ancestors settled, was in the Pyrenees. A big place or most, remarked on in the readings was Egypt. And Cayce talks about this sophisticated culture that flew in aircraft of a sorts, like balloons, and it was their technology that went into building the pyramids.
Truly remarkable individual. And he died in 1945. What did he die of?
Oh, it was a heart condition, and he eventually just ran out of gas. I mean, he was giving so many readings. He was ignoring his own advice.
Which a lot of people do, Sidney. A lot of people do that. What breakthroughs can we expect in the future from some of Edgar Cayce's work?
Science and technology is catching up to the readings. So I foresee great breakthroughs in terms of people turning back or people turning to the Cayce readings for insights. Engineers, like there's this device which appears in the reading called the perpetual motion machine. And it came through in readings for an engineer named Mitchell Hastings, who eventually would go on to do remote-controlled torpedoes in World War I. He designed, in World War II, he designed, remote-controlled torpedoes. He also became an engineer at IBM, and he received a great many of the science readings that we now have. Tantalizing, there are things he didn't say, but the perpetual motion motor was one of them, and it was a device, and it literally, Cayce in trance delivered, equivalent of blueprints on how this thing was to be made. It looked something like an evaporative cooler, and the challenges in constructing it were many. It had to be assembled underwater.
Interesting.
Like in a swimming pool. And so engineers went to work on this, and the idea was that once you got this motor spinning, it wouldn't stop on its own. And then you could just harness into, the rotation to create energy.
Has there ever been another Edgar Cayce?
It's something we're often asked. We've certainly come across various psychics who possess some of the talents that seem to come through with Cayce, but no one who's as comprehensive. If you go to the ARE, Association for Research Enlightenment website, you can get you can look things up by subject matter. And it's just astonishing, the list, the hundreds of different topics he touches on. But we've never, we have been amazed by various psychics over the years. Truly amazed. But we've never come across someone who was as compelling, who turned out, such a volume of work. And I keep harking back to this volume of work, 14,000 readings. And I think that's
huge.
That's a hugely valuable thing, because it goes, from the perpetual motion motor to anti-gravity. Unfortunately, Cayce didn't give the engineer the formula for anti-gravity. It's a very short reading, and it essentially comes back saying the world is not ready for this yet.
He took it to the grave with him, didn't he?
Yeah.
He said something about the presidency. What was that?
Well, in the 40s, or late 30s, early 40s, he was asked in trance who would make the best president. And what came back was Senator Burton Wheeler. And if you remember the great Jimmy Stewart movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Yes, based on him, wasn't it? Yeah.
that was based on the Burton Wheeler story. And so Cayce was also asked, well, why would he make for the best president? And, of course, there's the things we take for granted, or, well, we should take for granted in our leaders' integrity, cooperation. But Burton Wheeler was special in some really interesting ways because it foreshadowed World War II. And he actually ran against FDR, who was president for a lot of World War II. What was unique about Burton Wheeler was that in a past life, he'd been a Viking.
That's interesting. We're going to take a short break, Sidney, and we're going to come back and take phone calls with you next hour here on Coast to Coast. Our special guest tonight, Sidney Kirkpatrick, author of Edgar, Cayce, An American Prophet, also True Tales from the Cayce Vault. And his website is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. Calls next.